Okay, when you hear the name Albert Camus, what's the first thing that pops into your head? You're probably picturing that classic black and white photo, right? You know the one. Guy in a trench coat, cigarette dangling, staring bleakly out at this totally meaningless, absurd universe. Well, it's a super popular myth, but in today's explainer, we are going to completely dismantle it. We're going to uncover Camus' deeply passionate, grounded, and intensely moral true nature. We'll see exactly how his real-life, gritty experiences built a philosophy that was actually meant to be lived, not just studied in a classroom.
And to kick things off, let's look at this quote from Friedrich Nietzsche because it perfectly sets the stage for everything we're about to talk about. I esteem a philosopher just as much as he is able to set an example. See, for Camus, philosophy definitely wasn't just some abstract logic game to play in a dusty university hall. No way. It was a matter of flesh, blood, and daily action. A true philosopher has to literally embody their ideas out in the real world.
To really unpack all this, we are drawing from Michel Onfray's fascinating book, L'ordine libertario, or the libertarian order. Onfray uses a psychobiographical approach. Now, that's just a fancy way of saying he looks at how Camus' deepest psychological and childhood experiences actually forged his worldview. And as you'll see, this analysis proves that his ideas weren't born in chic Parisian cafes, but rather in the dust, the poverty, and the visceral reality of his early life in Algeria. All right, Section 1, Life over Systems. So Camus radically broke away from the trendy intellectual circles of his day. Onfray basically divides philosophy into two camps here. Over on the left, you've got the Prussian style. Think of guys like Hegel or Jean-Paul Sartre. This approach is super pedantic, highly systemic, and honestly, it tries to force the incredibly messy reality of human life into these neat, rigid little concepts. They build these massive theoretical castles that are, well, practically unlivable. Then, on the right, you have the Danish approach. Think Kierkegaard and, of course, Albert Camus. This is clear, lived philosophy. It's aimed at actually helping people, especially young people, navigate their existence. Camus wrote to be understood, not just to be endlessly debated by academics. Let's completely redefine the Camus reality. First off, he fiercely rejected the whole existentialist label. Instead, he was what we'd call a solar moralist. He literally loved the sun, the sea, the physical joy of just being alive. Plus, he was a visceral libertarian and an anarchist who deeply distrusted absolute state power. But above all else, he was a relentless voice for the poor, the humiliated, and the victims. He absolutely hated totalitarianism and cruelty, and he rooted his ethics in the actual flesh and blood of his upbringing, totally avoiding those abstract intellectual games. Which leads us to Section 2. The Parisian clash. Naturally, this hyper-grounded approach led to a really intense and honestly pretty bitter clash with the Parisian elite. In this little-known, unproduced satirical play that Camus wrote called L'impromptu des philosophes, he deliciously mocks the empty rhetoric of those Parisian thinkers. He creates this character named Mr. Nothing, which is clearly a massive job at art. So, Mr. Nothing goes to a provincial town to spread his big new philosophy. He tells this young couple that love doesn't exist, only physical action matters, so they'd better start procreating to prove their so-called commitment. And while all this is happening, Mr. Nothing's disciple is just munching on some delicious prosciutto, hilariously trying to philosophically justify eating his dinner while simultaneously claiming that absolutely nothing in the universe matters. It is a brilliant, funny takedown of how absurd these high-minded theories get when you apply them to everyday life. But listen, it wasn't all just lighthearted satire. Camus was highlighting a deeply tragic irony here. These intellectuals were basically treating philosophy as a consequence-free game of rhetoric. But in the real world, they were using their complex, high-minded concepts to justify literal atrocities. People like Sartre and his inner circle were actually defending Soviet concentration camps just because it happened to fit their abstract revolutionary theories. Camus was watching this from the outside, absolutely horrified that words were being twisted to excuse mass murder. Let's move on to Section 3, Legacy of the Father. To really understand Camus' unshakable ethical foundation, we actually have to start with a father he barely even knew. Lucien Camus' life was shockingly brief. He was born into deep poverty in Algeria, drafted into World War I, and died at the Battle of the Marne when Albert was literally just an infant. So Albert inherited almost nothing: some old photographs, a piece of shrapnel kept in a biscuit tin, and a few incredibly powerful stories passed down by his family. But the lessons Lucien imparted from beyond the grave, they completely shaped who Albert became. One of those stories is the absolute cornerstone of Camus's whole philosophy. Way before the war, there was a horrific murder in their local community. Lucien, who firmly believed in justice, woke up at 3 a.m. to go watch the public execution of the killer by guillotine. But witnessing the bloody, mechanical butchery of that execution, it fundamentally broke him. He came home completely pale, totally silent, and just vomited repeatedly. When this story was passed on to Albert, it planted this visceral, organic, almost physical revulsion to the death penalty that he carried for the rest of his life. He learned right then and there that institutionalized murder is really just vengeance wearing the mask of justice. And there was another story about his dad. While serving in Morocco, Lucien and his unit stumbled upon the brutally mutilated bodies of some fellow French soldiers. One of his comrades immediately tried to justify retaliating with equal barbarity. You know, the classic "they started it" argument. But Lucien, even as an uneducated farmhand, completely rejected that logic. He just said, no, a man restrains himself. That is what a man is. Otherwise, he firmly believes that violence absolutely cannot answer violence, and blood never justifies more blood. That one moment cemented Camus' lifelong belief. No abstract reasoning can ever justify the murder or torture of a human being. Which really brings up a profound question for us to ponder. How do you become what you are without the people who made you? Think about it. Camus had to construct his own concept of manhood, his own ethics, from the ghostly echoes of a father he never met. And, as we're going to see right now, from a mother who raised him in almost total silence. Section 4, Silence of the Mother. So how exactly did he build those ethics? Well, he looked right at his own home. The house Camus grew up in was a study in extreme contrasts. On one side, you had his grandmother. She ruled the place with an absolute iron fist. She was violent, cruel, she literally wielded a whip on young Albert, and she'd force him into humiliating situations, like making him lie about his age just to get summer jobs. Then, on the other side, you have his mother, Catherine. She was partially deaf, deeply submissive to the grandmother, and her entire vocabulary was barely 400 words. Yet, despite all of that, she just radiated this gentle, quiet compassion. Observing the oppressor and the oppressed coexisting right in his own living room, that taught Camus to deeply, personally despise injustice. And because his mother literally lacked the words to defend herself, Camus made it his absolute life's mission to be the voice for the voiceless. He adopted this brilliantly clear, stripped-down writing style. Academics like to call it a white, phenomenological ink. Just as there were no useless, fancy objects in his impoverished childhood home, there are absolutely no useless, purely decorative words in his philosophy. His clear, sharp writing was an act of profound respect for people just like his mother. He found true honor and dignity in their extreme poverty. And finally, Section 5, Gift of the Teacher. So if his parents handed him his moral compass, it was his teacher who actually gave him the map. Mr. Germain was a World War I veteran. One day in class, he started reading aloud from Wooden Crosses, which is this really gritty, realistic novel about the utter misery of the trenches. Young Albert was sitting right there in the front row, and he just began to weep uncontrollably. For the very first time, through the sheer magic of literature, this kid emotionally connected to the terrifying reality his father had faced before dying. Mr. Germain gently comforted him, and in that moment, Camus learned that words and books actually have the power to save us. They help us make sense of our deepest, darkest traumas. But here's the thing, Mr. Germain didn't just read to him. He recognized Albert's brilliance, and he actively stepped in. He stood up to that terrifying grandmother, insisting the boy had to stay in school instead of going off to work. He tutored Camus for free after hours, literally paying for things out of his own pocket. He even watched Camus and a few other poor students all the way to the high school scholarship exam, buying them croissants to calm their nerves. Mr. Germain literally saved Albert Camus from a deterministic life of heavy manual labor. He made sure that incredible intellect was nurtured. And just before Camus walked into that exam room, the room that would quite literally change his destiny forever, Mr. Germain squeezed his hand and simply said, "Va, figliolo, go, my son." With just those few gentle words of encouragement, this amazing teacher launched Camus out of deep poverty and straight into the literary world. And guess what? Camus never forgot it. Decades later, when he reached the absolute pinnacle of his career and won the Nobel Prize in Literature, he didn't thank the Parisian elite. He didn't thank the abstract philosophers. No, he dedicated his entire Nobel speech to Mr. Louis Germain. He even visited him later, bringing him a copy of that exact same trench novel. It's such a beautiful illustration that Camus' philosophy of gratitude, loyalty, and memory wasn't just stuff he wrote in books. It was a philosophy he truly, deeply lived. So, I want to leave you with this final thought. Look,
We live in a world that is just overflowing with abstract theories, endless online debates, and super loud opinions that are totally disconnected from reality. When you look at the incredibly grounded, hard-fought life of Albert Camus, you have to ask yourself, how can you take your own experiences, your own traumas, and your own joys, and transform them into a grounded, ethical reality? In a world obsessed with abstract theories, how will you ensure that your life actually sets an example? Keep thinking about that and keep living it.